In this video, we're going to look at the basics of viruses and what makes them unique in order so that in other videos we can go and take a look at some of the medications that we use to fight off viruses in our bodies. So let's start off with talking about viruses. Viruses are essentially parasites. They will invade host cells and then basically they hijack all of the processes, materials within the host cells in order to produce new viruses. So that is their sole goal, is just to reproduce themselves. They cannot replicate outside of host cells, and there are lots of different varieties in terms of shapes and sizes of viruses, but they generally consist of just a couple of pieces. They have a core, which is their genetic material, either in the form of DNA or RNA, depending on the virus itself, as well as a capsid, which is a protein coat that's going to surround the genetic information or the core. Those two things together are called the nucleocapsid, because that's where all of the genetic information is held. And then they could also have a lipid envelope. This is not all viruses, but if they do have this, it surrounds the nucleocapsid as well. So here's just a couple of examples to show you the variety of different kind of shapes and forms that viruses can take on. So T4 bacteriophage is a very, very simplistic kind of virus. It has a DNA core, and then it has this protein coat, and essentially that's the most of it. That's really all there is. The HIV virus is a lot more complicated. It's an RNA-based virus, and then it's got the capsid, which is surrounding the genetic material. But then that's also surrounded by this lipid membrane here. And there's a variety of different sort of like proteins that are around this as well that do help for it to bind to its host cells and then infect its host cells. But you can see between these two, there is quite a lot of differences in terms of what they're actually made of. Now, if viruses are considered not to be living cells because they don't feed, they don't excrete, and they don't grow. They only consist of what's necessary to be able to invade the host cell, and they cannot reproduce outside of the host cell. So that is really important. That is essentially the definition of something that is living, is that it can reproduce. And viruses are unable to do this, so they are not considered to be living cells. So taking a look at some of those differences then between viruses and bacteria. Bacteria are living, whereas viruses are not living. Bacteria are larger than viruses. And bacteria have a cellular structure. So they have things like a cell wall, cytoplasm, nucleus, etc. They have organelles, whereas a virus does not have any of those things. Now, bacteria do contain both DNA and RNA, whereas viruses only have one or the other. And bacteria can reproduce independently, whereas a virus requires a host cell to reproduce. So the lack of cell structure, so this sort of stuff here, makes it really that much more difficult to design drugs to target viruses than it does bacteria. And that's because of how sort of non-specific a virus is and how little it has essentially for us to be able to target. Now, how do viruses get into the host cell? This is quite a lot more complicated than this picture detects here. But essentially, the virus will come along and it will dock onto the host cell. And when it docks onto the host cell, a bunch of stuff happens that allows the virus to inject its viral genome into the cell. So this is a virus, essentially a T4 bacteriophage that is infecting a bacterial cell. Once this viral genome is inside of the cell, so remember this could be DNA or RNA, and it will then combine with the bacterial genome. It'll hijack it essentially, start creating a ton of the proteins and the genetic material needed to make new viruses, which will eventually overtake the cell, overrun it, essentially cause the cell to burst open and release all these new viruses back out into, the ether. So there's, like I said, much more complicated process than I'm making it, but we really just need to know the simplistic sort of things about how viruses get inside cells. So that was a really, really quick introduction into viruses. That's it for this video. We'll see you in the next one.